Well, thank you, Allie. Thanks very much for having me here. I greatly appreciate it. Daniel setting this up, Nikolai making sure everything ran very smoothly. I've been very impressed. Greatly appreciate being here. So I'm going to talk about one of the chapters in my new book, At the Brink, basically dealing with gun control issues, because I think this is one area that the President is going to leave his mark. He's going to have a legacy for a while with regard to. And I've kind of been, it's just not at the federal level. I've actually been surprised. I was out in Colorado about a month ago at the invitation for some state legislators. And one of the things that had come up just the day before I'd gotten there was that the White House, and in particular Vice President Biden, had been calling up members of the Colorado State Assembly there and lobbying them to get them to switch their votes. Apparently he was able to get 7 of them to switch, and he was promising that if they voted the right way that the President would help them out next year in their campaigns for re-election, and if they didn't help out, there was an implication that the White House would get involved in trying to get primary opponents for them to run against them. I don't know. That's the type of arm twisting you might see at the federal level for the White House, but I think it's the first time I've heard of a president getting deeply involved in state legislative races on what's a state issue, but I guess it just goes to some extent to show how much the President cares very intensely about this gun issue. And the 7 was enough to get 4 bills through the state house that would not have gotten through if they hadn't switched all those votes. What I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about some of the gun control bills that are before us nationally, but in particular just talk about the one I think is most likely to pass, and that is dealing with these universal background checks. And unfortunately, I think a lot of what's being said right now isn't very accurate, but more importantly, kind of as my training as an economist and what I try to get into in the book, all these laws that we talk about have both costs and benefits. Often we hear about the benefits here. I mean, everybody wants to try to keep criminals from trying to get guns. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But these laws also have some costs too, and I think we need to try to talk about those a little bit. So one set of statements that we'll start off with is just the claim about this 40% of gun sales don't go through background checks. So the President, when he announced his proposals in January, said, but it's hard to enforce that law when as many as 40% of all gun purchases are conducted without a background check. That's not safe, that's not smart. And Vice President Biden made pretty much the same statement. He said the consensus is about 40% of the people who buy guns today do so outside the National Instant Criminal Background Check system. Well, unfortunately, these statements are not quite right. And just to kind of summarize it, there's a study done during the Clinton administration. It was a relatively small survey, about 251 people. But what that survey claimed was that 36% of gun transfers didn't go through a background check system. So what the President basically did, he took the 36, rounded up to 40%, but that's minor. The big thing was changing the terms transfers to sales, because there's a huge difference between talking about transfers between individuals and talking about sales. In fact, the vast majority of these transfers are within family gifts or inheritances. And it's kind of a question whether it would have had quite the same, I mean, say 40% of transfer, or 40% of sales don't go through background checks, sounds like a somewhat shocking number. But if the President had gone and said, look, there's a lot of parents who are either giving gifts or inheritances to their kids, I'm not sure that would be quite as shocking or quite as upsetting to most people. This survey that's been focused on covered sales of guns or purchases of guns between transfers of guns between 1991, November 1991 and December 1994. And the reason why that's important is that gun sales have changed a lot over time. One of the biggest changes was something that Bill Clinton did, and that was passing or signing into law the Brady background check system. And that went into effect in February 28th, 1994. So most of this period covered by this sample was like 80% of it was before the federal Brady Act went into effect. And so, you know, one would be questionable how relevant it would be for today, given that the current background check systems aren't even in effect, and that's what we're talking about here. You know, what percentage of sales or transfers are going through background checks. So there are other things that have changed too over time, but if you just were to go and ask the question, the way the president and others have stated this, what percent of sales went through federally licensed dealers? It would have been about 13% rather than the 40% claim. But even then, there's a bit of a problem, because one of the things that Bill Clinton did was he really changed who was a licensed dealer. So if you go back to 1992, what you'd find is there were about 284,000 federally licensed firearms dealers in the United States. By the end of Bill Clinton's term, that was down to about 100,000. So you really had like a 2/3 cut in the number of federally licensed dealers. And what Clinton had focused on was so-called kitchen table dealers. These would be individuals that would have a license. It only cost like $10, very easy to go and get at the time. And people would sell guns at gun shows or out of their home or what have you. And I've done a survey of these individuals, and what you find is that, you know, it's not like they had a big sign that said, "I'm a federally licensed dealer." They themselves believe that very few people who had been buying guns from them at their home or at a gun show would know that they were federally licensed dealers or not. And so, you know, these are people, the perception is that if somebody bought a gun at a gun store or at a pawn shop or something like that, they would know that the individual was a licensed dealer. But it's not, as I say, it's not like you had a big sign in your home that said, "I'm a federally licensed dealer." And this survey is merely asking these respondents whether they thought they were buying from a licensed dealer or not, whether they were actually doing so or not. And my guess is if you corrected that, the true number back in this early 90s period would have been in the low single digits, probably. You get some idea of how important inheritances and gifts are within the family. Just the bottom two things there. 93% of gifted guns are within family transfers, and 91% of inherited guns come from within the family. Now, there's another claim. So that's one of the two big claims that have been made for the background checks. The other big claim that I talk about in At the Brink is this claim that, and the number kind of changes. 1.5 million prohibited individuals have been prevented from buying a gun, according to the president. Other times he said 1.7 million. Again, there's been a subtle change in the language that's used here. When the president says 1.5 million or 1.7 million prohibited individuals have been prevented, what the right terminology is initial denials. So there's been 1.7 million initial denials. There's a big difference between using the term initial denials and saying prohibited individuals prevented. So you may remember the late Senator Ted Kennedy, for example. He was on the no-fly list 5 times. Apparently there's somebody else out there who has a similar name, Ted Kennedy's, and that they really did want to stop. And there were 5 times when Kennedy would show up at the airport and he was told, "Your name's on the prohibited list here, and so you're not allowed to fly on the plane." Now, he later flew on another plane, but he was, quote unquote, initially denied being able to get on the plane there. Now, would anybody go and count those as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying? The 5 times we stopped the late senator from flying? So nobody would do that, right? But that's essentially what we're saying with regard to these purchasers of guns. They're initially denied, but just because you're initially denied doesn't mean we should count all those as prohibited individuals prevented. In fact, when you look through the numbers, it's pretty clear that almost all of those are false positives. Won't go through all the details here, but there's essentially 4 different steps in the process. And just even after the initial review, 94% of those initial denials are dropped. And there was a survey done by the NICS system about people who, the later ones that survived that initial drop, and even 20% of those. So when you add it up, it's basically about 95% of the people that were initially denied were false positives. Now, there's an important thing here, and that is when you're talking about this 1.7 million initial denials, for the vast majority of them, it's simply going to be an inconvenience. You know, they'll live with the fact that they can't go and buy a gun maybe for a couple months or a few months. But with such a large number, you're going to find a small but statistically significant group of people that may have needed to get a gun quickly for self-defense. Somebody who's suddenly threatened or stalked, and denying them months being able to go and buy a gun can be the difference between whether or not they're going to be safe or not. And that's not the only problem that's there. There's another number that's about 5 to 7 times larger than this initial denial numbers, where it's just delayed. And these purchases can be delayed for up to 3 full days. And what you find is that almost all of these delays are. And even short delays can make the difference between whether or not somebody's able to go and defend themselves or not. What you find is that, particularly for crimes against women, again, it's not a large effect, but you'll find about a 2% increase in rape rates and about a 2% increase in aggravated assaults against women just by having that delay. So again, it's not a large effect, but you're going to have some cases where women are being stalked or threatened and can't even wait a few days if you're worried about their safety and their ability to go and defend themselves, to be able to get a gun for self-defense. Now, when we talk about this, again, we have to look at both the costs and the benefits. And obviously, one of the benefits is going to be how many criminals are we really stopping as a result of these types of background checks. And it turns out not to be very large. If you take the numbers for 2010, there were about 76,000 of these initial denials. If you look at the prosecutions that go through, basically 62 of those 76,000 initial denials are referred for prosecution. 44 of those go through, are prosecuted, and in 2010 they got 13 convictions. And when you actually go, if you actually look at these 13 cases, they're not what you would really call hardened criminals. They're cases where you may have some 65-year-old guy who wanted to buy a gun for his wife because she had been threatened by somebody. He had apparently gotten into a fist fight with his brother 45 years earlier on their front yard, and some neighbors had called the police and arrested him, and they both pleaded guilty to misdemeanor domestic violence. And he claims that he didn't realize that was a covered offense when he filled out the form to go and buy a gun. This is 4473 form. And if you put what's false information on there and you sign it, you're committing perjury. And that's one of the things that they can prosecute you for. And the government successfully argued in that case that he knew that this was something he should have put down. He didn't put it down, and therefore he committed perjury, which is 3 years in jail, and the government won the case. But when you look at these cases, that's basically cases that you see. You don't see, hardened criminals going and being stupid enough, apparently, to go through and trying to buy the guns through these background checks. And so that raises this question about what's the net effect. And as I say, the empirical evidence indicates that even the short delays, let alone the long delays, can have significant net impacts on people's safety. So I I want to talk more generally about something that's motivating a lot of this discussion, and that is these horrible multiple victim public shootings that we have. And there's lots of ways we can think about this, but I want to step back for a second and talk about what we call gun-free zones. And these can take a lot of different forms. But I think just the easiest way to talk about it to begin with is just say, can you name me one place in the world where guns have been banned that we, either all handguns or all guns, and find that murder rates fell? Because I can't find it. Every place in the world that's either banned guns has seen murder rates go up by at least a little bit or a lot. And, in the United States, we've had some experience with this. Part of the experience that we've had has been with major cities like Washington, D.C. and Chicago. I think most Americans are familiar with the fact that murder rates and violent crime rates increased in both of those places. They may not know exactly how much they increased in both of the places. But usually what happens when those are brought up is people will say, well, those really weren't fair tests, because unless you go and ban guns every place in a country, criminals in D.C. could get guns in Maryland, Virginia, or they could go and get guns in the rest of Illinois or Indiana or Michigan. But the problem is, I don't really think that explains the increase in murder rates. It may explain why murder rates didn't fall, or may not have explained why they didn't fall much in that case. But they could have gotten guns from those places to begin with before the bans. They could get them afterwards. It's not really clear why that would explain an increase. And as I'll show you, around the world, when you look at this, even for island nations, even when the entire country bans guns and you have kind of the ideal experiment with an island so you have no neighbor to go and blame for this, and it's relatively easy to defend and define borders that are there, you still see increases in murder rates and violent crimes after these bans are in place. And finally, I guess it would have been nice if they really did think at the time that it was an unfair test, that they had kind of told people that was going to be increases in murder rates, because I don't think they would have passed. But that's not what was usually promised. Now, there are many areas in life that we have gun-free zones. I've been involved with some of them because of my research that I've done over the years. But one of the things I just want to get across to you right now is usually in these discussions there's kind of this hypothetical story about what might go wrong if you allow guns in certain areas. After 9/11, I served as a consultant for several of the airline pilots unions because they were trying to go and allow guns on planes. And the interesting thing there is the types of stories or hypothetical things that were said to go wrong if you allowed pilots to carry guns. So one of the examples I remember a senator saying to me is, what happens if you actually have two pilots that have a gun and they get into an argument and they pull them out and they kill each other? Then what are you going to do? You're going to have two dead pilots and nobody's going to be there to fly the plane at that point. Or you'd have other stories about, what happens if a pilot accidentally fires a bullet and hits the side of the plane. I guess people have seen a few too many James Bond movies, and they think that there'll be this explosive depressurization and people will get sucked out. Just so you know, are there any pilots here? There's always a few. That, there's lots of holes already in planes, all over the place. I mean, it's not like the Air Force has to worry about one bullet going into a fuselage and the plane, the pilot's getting sucked out in the explosive depressurization. In fact, there's any commercial planes you're in, there's a large hole in the back which basically helps bring the air through the fuselage there. But the thing is, you don't need to guess about these hypotheticals in most of these cases. And the pilot's example is a perfect example. You may not realize this, but from 1925 up until 1963, every commercial airline pilot in the United States was mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them whenever they flew. And they were allowed to carry a handgun with them up until 1979 when President Jimmy Carter ended the practice. What had happened was, in the 1920s, when the government started hiring planes to go and carry the mail, the concern was that you're going to have a plane crash someplace in some cornfield with the mail, and they wanted to make sure that the pilot was armed so he could keep the mail from getting stolen. And it was one of these rules that just kind of went into effect and just stayed there for 4 decades before anybody kind of noticed it or thought about it again. Obviously, it was kind of well past the time when you'd worry about a biplane crashing into a cornfield. And, but the thing is, when you look at that record, you in fact find that the pilots, or there was no problem with them carrying guns. You go through the old CAB records, you go through the FAA records that are there, and you could not find one single example where a pilot on a plane with a gun, even though there were millions of flights. And I assume from the age of people here, there's a lot of people like myself who would have flown on planes at that time, and we wouldn't even have known that the pilots were always armed that were on the plane, but yet they were, and we never thought twice about it when we were flying back at that point in time. And just to give you one other example, has anybody read Colin Powell's autobiography or Antonin Scalia's autobiography? Both of these two guys grew up in New York City, and one of the things that they mention in their autobiographies is that they were on the riflery teams for their high schools. In fact, up until 1969, June 1969, all but one of the public high schools in New York City had a riflery team. And one of the things that was interesting is that apparently on any given school day, you'd have someplace between 6,000 and 8,000 students in 1969 who would be carrying their rifles with them to school in the morning because the guns weren't kept at school. They would be stored and this is New York City, this isn't Arkansas. They'd be storing the guns unlocked in the back of the classrooms. They'd pick them up at the end of the day. All but one of the riflery ranges were off of school property, so they'd have to carry them to where the riflery range is. And then when they were done shooting, they would carry them home on city streets, on buses and taxi cabs. You know, you go and you tell a New Yorker today that in 1969 you'd have up to 8,000 kids between the ages of 13 and 18 walking around on New York City streets carrying rifles on any given school day, and they just won't believe you. You know, it's just so far outside. But again, you go through the records and you just don't see any evidence of things going wrong. And of course, as I mentioned, you got international evidence on these things. I just thought, I used to work for Steve Breyer when he was one of the commissioners at the Sentencing Commission when I was chief economist there. And I thought in the Heller dissent, this was the ruling that struck down DC's gun bans and their gun laws. I think he summarized pretty well the concern that a lot of people have with regard to guns and these gun-free zones issues. Steve wrote, if a resident has a handgun in the home that he can use for self-defense, then he has a handgun in the home that he can use to commit suicide or engage in acts of domestic violence. If it is indeed the case, as the district believes, that the number of guns contributes to the number of gun-related crimes, accidents, and deaths, then although there may be less restrictive, less effective substitutes for an outright ban, there is no less restrictive equivalent of an outright ban. And if you read his dissent, Breyer basically said, look, he didn't believe that there was an individual right to own guns, but even if there was, he would argue that it would be overcome by the public safety issues. And you get an idea of how important the empirical issue was to Steve and to the other 3 justices that signed his dissent. If you just read through his dissent there, he uses the word crime, criminal, criminologist, homicide, murder, rape, robbery, and victim 109 times in the 44-page dissent. The term suicide was used an additional 13 times, and there are other similar terms I could have added in here. But so that's an average of about 3 words a page that are essentially empirical type issues that were there. And I could go and give you 30 pages of these types of quotes easily, but when the DC, the Heller case came down from the Supreme Court, that day you had predictions from U.S. senators, from the mayor of Washington, D.C. here, and many others, predicting that there was going to be disaster afterwards. Mayor Fenty said more handguns in the District of Columbia will only lead to more gun violence. Mayor Daley talked about more blood in the streets, and that we would, quote, go back to the Old West, you have a gun, I have a gun, and we'll settle in the streets. Now, I don't think most people understand the difference between the Chicago and DC cases. I'll just talk about it very briefly. They both dealt with handgun bans, and that's what most people think about. But there was a really important difference, and that is the DC decision also struck down their gun lock rules. It used to be, up until 2008, a felony for you to actually chamber a bullet in a long gun. So you could go and own a rifle or a shotgun, but if you put a bullet in the chamber or a shotgun shell in the chamber, it was a felony for 5-year minimum prison term that was there. And so there were cases when people would use long guns in self-defense, but they would go to jail for doing that. And the justice said, look, we can go and say you have a right to self-defense and let you own handguns, but if it's a crime, a felony, for you to go and actually use the gun, it kind of takes away the benefit that we're giving you in terms of self-defense there. So they struck that down. And the reason why that's important is that in both DC and Chicago, there's only still been a few people who have been able to register handguns. In DC, it's a little bit over 2,000. In Chicago, it's been about 3,000 people. And when you're talking about a city of about 2.5 million people, it's not really a lot that's happened there. And basically the reason is in DC, in order to go through the process, it costs, like the Washington Post said, it costs $534, plus you have the training time and other things. In Chicago, it's also very expensive. And so basically you only have fairly wealthy individuals who have gone through the process in these cities to go and get guns. And I would argue you may not expect much of a benefit in terms of reduced crime from the handgun part of it, simply because the people who benefit the most are poor blacks, I would argue, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, and they're almost zero in terms of being willing to pay, you know, hundreds of dollars to go through and pay the fees and do the other things to go and get the permits to own the handguns. But the thing is, with DC, there was a big change because you had about 72,000 people who legally registered long guns, and now with the Supreme Court decision, they were able to go and use those guns legally, defensively. So that's about a quarter of the adult population that overnight you were now able, a quarter of the adult population had guns, long guns, that they could now use defensively. You had no similar change in Chicago. And so there's something just to mention. Now, well, before I get into that, there's lots of ways I could go and show you the data for these two cities. One simple way of looking at it is just look at their rank among other cities in terms of murder rates. Prior to February '77, when DC's gun ban and gun lock rules went into effect, you had DC would regularly rank about 20th or so in terms of murder rates among the top 50 cities. Some years it had gotten as high as 15, but that's generally the range that was in. In the 30 years that we had the ban in effect for DC, DC was either number 1 or number 2 half the years. It was in the top 4 2/3 of the time. There's no time period prior to the ban where DC was anywhere near remotely to being in the top 4 that we saw afterwards. As I say, the highest it got was 15. Other ways you could look at is just how DC's murder rate changed over time. After the ban, there's only 1 year where its murder rate was as low as it was the year prior to the ban going into effect. And the third way, I'll just show you in a second here, is just to see kind of how, you know, DC's murder rate as a percentage of murder rates for other large cities. And if you look at this here, I don't know if I have a, whoops, that didn't work. DC's murder rate was falling relative to other cities prior to the ban. As soon as the ban went into effect in early '77, it went back up, bouncing around about 40, 60%. By the time you get to about 13 years out, it's about 80% higher than the average in the other cities. After you get to 13 years, you have a big explosion here. We had crack cocaine epidemic for about 4 years here, but of course that was national. I would argue it had a bigger impact in DC simply because people with limited abilities there to defend themselves, but that's something one can debate. But even after the crack cocaine epidemic ended, DC remained remarkably high compared to to other cities. And one thing that's interesting here is just to compare how DC's murder rate changed after they struck down this gun law that they had and actually made it legal for the quarter of the adult population to be able to go and use their long guns defensively. The Supreme Court decision occurred in the very end of June. Within a month, not loud enough? Sorry about that. Within a month after the Supreme Court decision, they had passed new rules there allowing, kind of codifying the Supreme Court decision. So what you want to try to do is compare apples to apples here, looking at the same period of time that the rules are in effect, and murder rates and violent crime rates vary a lot over the course of a year. You have a lot more murders during the summer than you have during the winter, for example. So if we look at the numbers for the first 7 months of 07, first 7 months of 08, 09, 2010, 2011, 2012, you can see that, so this is the last 7 months that these rules were in effect. In 07, there were 104 murders during those first 7 months. In 08, there was 107. In 09, so this is the first time that the rules are in effect and these 25% of the population are able to go and use their guns legally, defensively, it fell to 82, 70 in 2010, 62 in 2011, and 51 this last year. That's a 52% drop in murder rates from what you saw in 2008. Now, there are lots of things I could point out here. I'll just mention one thing. We see violent crime rates kind of fell across the board, but one thing that's interesting, and it confirms other research out there, is that when you allow law-abiding citizens to have guns, gun crime falls more than other types of crime. And so, for example, if you look at robberies without guns, robberies with guns, robberies without guns were essentially flat. It's essentially zero change. Robberies with guns fell by a little over 11%. You have aggravated assaults without guns, aggravated assaults with guns. Aggravated assaults without guns fell by 4%. Aggravated assaults with guns fell by about 31%. Now, so I can show you the stuff for Chicago here. Chicago's ban went into effect in November 1982, the end of November 1982. And if you look at Chicago's murder rate relative to the murder rate in the other 10 largest cities, it's falling fairly consistently prior to the ban going into effect. When the ban went into effect there, you can see a slight increase, and basically it's generally trending up. There's no year after the ban where it's as low relative to other cities as it was immediately prior to the ban going into effect. Now, how about other countries? I'm just going to show you some data for island nations that have had bans on guns, either all handguns or all guns that are there. And this is for the UK. There, if you have seen me talking with Piers Morgan about this is the type of stuff I've been trying to talk about. So Piers has a little bit of problem comparing levels versus changes, and this is what I've been trying to explain. So anyway, their handgun ban went into effect in January 1st, 1997. And there's a very large increase in murder rates that happened there, basically about a 50% increase for about 7 years, and then it fell after that. Well, something that's interesting to point out, it's still higher though, the murder rate is still higher now than it was right before the ban went into effect. So what happened? Well, people in Britain were pretty upset with the rising violent crime. It wasn't just murders that were going up, it was violent crime generally, and so they had about an 18% increase in police officers right at that time, which is a pretty large increase. Somebody who's a mayor, you can imagine the impact you'd have from an 18% increase in the number of police officers. And you can see right here, 2002, 2003 is where you really get the big increase. It's come down slightly in 2012. but it's still much higher than it was beforehand. And I would argue the reason for this 7-year delay before we started seeing this drop in murder rates is basically that's when we get this big increase in police officers, and it's not a 7-year delay effect from having a ban go into effect there. But you can look at other countries. There are a couple other countries that have had gun bans. One's Ireland. This is the Republic of Ireland, not Northern Ireland. And you can see they had a gun ban that went into effect in January 1972. The murder rate in Ireland was kind of bouncing around all over the place prior to that. When you had the change here, there's a big increase. Now, we can go and talk about a couple things here, like there's a lot of drug gang type activity that's occurring at this later date in particular. But at best it shows that the ban didn't stop the drug gangs from getting a hold of guns, and we can talk more about that. You can look at Jamaica, another island nation that had a gun ban. Their murder rate during the 60s and 70s was very similar to the murder rate in the United States. Their gun ban went into effect in January 1995. You can see the increase that occurred there. Now, there was some political violence that was here. And again, there's a fair amount of drug gang violence that you have over here. But even taking those out, you still have an obvious increase. And again, it just shows how hard it is to go and deal with, keep even drug gangs from getting guns. Now, I'll just mention one thing, and that is, you know how hard we've tried to stop illegal drugs from coming into this country. There's a report that came out at the beginning of the Obama administration. I can question some things and disagree with some of the assumptions they make, but the basic point that they were making was that they were claiming about 80% of violent crime in the United States was gang-related, and that the vast majority of that was drug gang-related. If you look across the United States, 78% of the counties in the United States have 0 murders in any given year. You have 3% of the counties account for over 70% of the murders. And if you ever lived in a city like New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Washington, D.C., and you look at the major newspapers once a year, they'll often show you a map of the distribution of murders there. And they're not evenly spread out even in those areas. They're usually very heavily concentrated in a few small areas that are there, and a lot of that is just drug gang related. And the point is that just as we find it hard to go and stop illegal drugs from coming into the country, you find it very hard to stop the gangs from bringing in the weapons that they need to have to protect those illegal drugs. It's not like they can go call up the police and say, this other gang stole our drugs, can you go and get them back for us? And it's not like, they can go and protect their drug turf by just calling the police. They have to essentially set up their own little militaries in order to do that. And if they can smuggle in the illegal drugs, they can smuggle in the weapons that they use to be able to protect that. Anyway, I just was going to show you something here just briefly, because one of the things that the Obama administration's been pushing has been licensing people for guns. They've been pushing this in Maryland and some other states that look likely to adopt it. One state that adopted this before was Massachusetts. In 1998, there was about 1.54 million people living in Massachusetts who were licensed to own guns. Right now, it's about 200,000. They've essentially used the licensing system to reduce fairly dramatically the number of people who own guns, about an 80% drop over that period of time. It's interesting to compare what's happened to Massachusetts' murder rate compared to the rest of the United States, or compare it to its neighbors. So this is kind of like the ratios I was just showing you before for Chicago and Washington, D.C. Massachusetts' murder rate relative to the United States, it's still lower than the other parts. This is about 65%, that's about 70-some%, so it's about 30% or so less than the rest of the country. But back here, it was in the 40% range. When the registration went into effect, it started going up, and you can see the change that occurred there. If you look at it relative to its neighbors, it was about 60% of the rate of the murders in its neighbors. And now it's gone up to about 90% of the rate of murders of its neighbors. Fairly dramatic change that's there that just coincides with the use of licensing in order to reduce it. Because you have to get a license, but you have to get approval from a sheriff. Sheriffs are very reticent to do it. It costs money to do it. One of the things also you see with these things is the change in who has guns. When you start charging these $100 fees and these training requirements, who do you think stops legally owning guns when you do that? It's basically poor minorities who live in high crime urban areas. The people that I would argue benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and defend themselves. You know, nationally, if you look at incomes and gun ownership rates, it's remarkably constant across income categories. You know, basically the same percentage of low-income people own guns as high-income people own guns. But you look at Chicago, where you have to pay literally hundreds of dollars in fees, and then you have to go and pay another $150, $200 for the training requirements that are there. People who have zip codes that have a median family income of $30,000 own handguns at about half the rate of zip codes where you have a median family income of $60,000, and those at $60,000 own handguns at half the rate of those who have median family income of $120,000. So rather than this flat rate that you see across the whole country, when they have to pay these big fees, it's basically a four-fold difference in the rate at which people have handguns in Chicago based upon income just going from $30,000 median family income to $120,000. And I would argue, you know, the people who you're denying it are the ones, if my research tells me anything, it's that it's basically the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime who benefit the most from having a gun. That police are extremely important, but police almost always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. I mean, I think police are the single most important factor. But those who are most likely to be victims benefit the most from having the option to protect themselves. So anyway, let me just go through some things quickly here. And that is, the question is, why do we keep seeing these increases in violent crime when we go and we ban the guns there? And I think there's a pretty simple reason, and that is when you go and you ban the guns, you have to ask who obeys these rules. And it's basically the law-abiding good citizens who turn in their guns, not the criminals. And no matter how well-meaning these laws are, if you unintentionally disarm law-abiding citizens relative to the criminals, you actually make it easier for the criminals to go and commit crimes rather than harder for them to do so. Let me give you an example, since I wanted to bring this in terms of these gun-free zones for these types of crimes that we're talking about. You know, take something like the Virginia Tech attack, in which 32 people were killed. If you live in Virginia, you basically can, and you have a concealed handgun permit, you can literally carry it virtually any place in the state. There's only a few places that you can't have it. You can't have it in courthouses, you can't have it in airports, and you can't have it in schools. But if you're a professor and you're able to carry it virtually any place in the state, and you accidentally carry it onto school property, and you get caught, you're going to get fired for a firearms-related violation. What do you think the chances are of that professor getting another academic job someplace in the country? It's essentially zero. I mean, if you get fired from a university for a firearms-related violation, good luck. I mean, we're going to ask the dean here who introduced Allie or something what the chances of somebody getting hired. My guess is as close to zero as you can get. If you're a student, you know, you're an MBA or a law student or whatever, you're over 21, again, you can carry the gun virtually any place. If you get caught accidentally carrying a gun on school property, you're going to get expelled. And your chances of being able to go and get admitted to another school for firearms-related violation on school property is, again, almost zero. It may be not quite as low as the professor's chances, but it's going to be pretty darn close to that. But think of the killer in that case. You know, if you've taken a law school class on marginal deterrence or something here, what you're going to find argue is that, here's a guy who's already going to, assuming he had lived, and of course they almost always die, about 75% of the time these guys die, and the other 25%, it looks like they planned on dying, but they just couldn't bring themselves at the last moment to go and kill themselves. What you have happen is that if he had lived, he would be facing 32 death penalties or 32 life sentences plus additional penalties. The notion that somehow the threat of expulsion would be the key penalty that would have kept him from going, as if he thinks he's still going to go to school with 32 death penalties or life sentences there, isn't going to be exactly very likely. And so, but the thing is, who did we stop? If a law-abiding person violated that rule, their lives are going to be unalterably changed in a major way. For this killer, the additional penalty there is trivial. It doesn't matter at all to him whether he's going to commit that crime. And so what you've done is you basically made it so that the law-abiding citizens are going to be the ones who are going to obey these rules and not the criminals. Now, Bill Landis at the University of Chicago and I looked at all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States from 1977 through 1999. And what we found was that we looked at 13 different types of gun control laws, we looked at law enforcement, we looked at lots of things. Law enforcement, while it has a huge, important, major impact, I think the major impact for violent crimes generally, had no impact on these multiple victim public shootings. No statistically significant impact. And there's a simple reason for that. And that is law enforcement punishes people after the fact. If you're committing a crime where there's a 75% chance of you dying, and the only reason the other 25% doesn't occur is because you can't bring yourself to kill yourself at the last moment, it doesn't really matter to you what you think is going to happen later on because you're not expecting to be alive there to have to deal with that. We looked at 13 different types of gun control laws. The only one that mattered was the passage of right-to-carry laws, and the effect was huge. When states passed right-to-carry laws, there was a 60% drop in the rate of multiple victim public shootings. And to the extent to which these attacks still occurred, they kept on occurring overwhelmingly in these tiny areas within the states where permanent concealed handguns weren't allowed. I don't know if you know this. I'll just give you an example or two. You may remember, it's such a good example, but it's so consistent with what's happening. The Batman movie theater shooting last year. There were 7 movie theaters showing the premiere of the Batman movie within a 20-minute drive of the killer's apartment. Only one of those movie theaters posted signs banning permanent concealed handguns. The killer didn't go to the movie theater that was closest to his home. There was one that was literally only 1.2 miles away. He didn't go to the movie theater that advertises itself on billboards, and if you call up the hotline, the first thing that they mention is that is the home of the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado. You would think if somebody wants to go and kill lots of people, he'd go on a premiere night to the place that had the largest auditoriums to go and do his attack. That movie theater was actually virtually the same distance from the killer's apartment as the one he ended up going to. The one he went to was the only one that had posted signs banning permanent concealed handguns. When you look at the mall shootings that have happened in the United States, time after time, it's the only mall that's posted is the one that they go to. If this was random at some point, 98, 99% of these multiple victim public shootings would be taking place where guns are allowed, not overwhelmingly in the other direction. And, if you look since at least 1950, with just 2 exceptions, all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States have taken place where guns are banned. And the same is true for Europe. All the multiple victim public shootings, even in Switzerland. Switzerland had no gun-free zones prior to 2000. They only have a few right now. Concealed carry is very easy in Switzerland. In half the cantons, you don't need a permit. It's like the states that we have the constitutional carry, like Vermont or Arizona or places like that. They've had 3 big shootings since 2000 now in Switzerland. I can't find any evidence of any of them occurring before that. And they've all occurred in the government buildings which are designated as gun-free zones now. And, I just think at some point, if the media were to report that yet another attack has occurred where these guns are banned, it would have some impact on the discussion here. Now, just quickly, you look at Israel, for example. Israel is really interesting. I mean, they've had terrorist attacks from even before the country was founded. If you look at the terrorist attacks in the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, they virtually all involved machine guns. After 72, virtually all the terrorist attacks in Israel involved bombs. Does anybody know what changed in 72? They started letting citizens carry concealed handguns. You've had as much as 15% of the Jewish population carry concealed handgun. Why does that change things? Well, imagine you have a terrorist on a bus, and you have 2 police officers that are there. Terrorists have huge strategic advantages, and Israel learned this the hard way over the years. Terrorists can do one of 2 things. He can either be patient and wait for the police officers to leave the bus and then do the attack, or he can kill the police officers first, because they're readily identifiable. They're in uniform that's there, and then go and kill the other people. Israel kept on trying to spend more and more money trying to cover all possible targets, but they realized it was impossible, because if a terrorist was simply willing to be patient long enough, there'd be some opening that would occur that they could see an opportunity to go and do an attack. When they moved to letting civilians carry it, basically the idea was that, look, the terrorist doesn't know, like he did with the police officers or the military, who he's supposed to take out first. Could be a person to the right or left, behind him, in front, who might have a gun. And you'd have, as I mentioned, about 15% of the adult Jewish population being allowed to carry in Israel. And so what terrorists did was they switched to bombs, and you look at the mortality in the attacks, they've gone down. And what's happened is that the reason why you do a bomb is because when I pull out my gun, I give people a chance to respond. When I go and set off a bomb, there's usually not too much to respond to there. But one story that I've had in my books before was in Tel Aviv in 1972, right after the change had occurred. There was an attack by 4 terrorists armed with machine guns in a suburban mall. And they pulled out their machine guns. This is on a weekday afternoon during school. Pulled out their machine guns, started firing, and the civilians around them pulled out their handguns, fired back, killed 3 of the terrorists. 1 was severely wounded. And the reason why I've included this story in some of the stuff I've written is that when the surviving terrorist was rushed to the hospital, the attendant in the ambulance reported to the newspaper, he said the terrorist was just incredibly upset. Nobody had told him that these older women in the mall would all have handguns and would be pulling them out in order to go and shoot the terrorists that were there. So anyway, I could go and talk. Europe actually has about the same rate of multiple victim public shootings as the United States. We don't think about it that way because there's so many small different countries that we don't add them up, and it's just not the Norwegian attack, which holds the record for the most number of people killed in one of these shootings. There was 69 people killed in the shooting part of it, 110 people wounded. But up until Newtown, the 3 worst K through 12 public shootings in the world were all in Europe. And it wasn't just the one in England, but 2 of the 3 worst were in Germany, and both had occurred over the last decade. You know, you go through this stuff. I often get calls from people in the media in Europe that will say, what is it about the United States that causes you guys to have these things? And I go and, if I get a guy from Germany, I'd say, well, could you tell me what country has had 2 of the 3 worst public school shootings? And then usually we go on to some other topic there at that point. But they often don't think about it. When an attack occurs in Europe, it gets like a day of coverage in the United States at most. When an attack occurs in the United States, it gets coverage for months in Europe afterwards. Now, I could talk about permit holders. I'll just mention this, that they're extremely law-abiding. I've gone through data for 25 states. You find that losses for permits for any firearms-related violation is hundreds or thousands of 1 percentage point. But a couple things I just want to leave you with. One is the people who benefit the most from owning guns, my research convinced me, are 2 groups of people. People who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, and people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. That overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. People who are most likely to be victims of violent crime benefit the most from having the option to be able to protect themselves. And so I would argue it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. And just in conclusion, the thing that concerns me and what I've tried to emphasize in this discussion is that so much of the discussion about these gun control laws, whether it be what seems to be the most popular one in terms of these universal background checks or these other things, only looks or talks about the benefits. We all want to try to keep criminals from getting a hold of guns, but we have to realize that these laws also have costs. And it doesn't make any sense. The president will say, if it saves one life, we should adopt these laws. That makes as much sense as me saying, if one person dies because of the gun control law, we shouldn't have it. The question needs to be, what's the net effect on safety? On net, how many lives are going to be saved or lost from that? And you have to look at both the costs and benefits, and that's one thing that I fear has been completely left out of this discussion. And the reason why I wrote At the Brink, in part, was to go and try to inform people about those types of trade-offs so that we can have more of a discussion on this. But I thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
We do have time for some questions. Just a couple. Raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, sir. 1 second. Wait for a microphone.
Would you comment, please, about the experience in New York City?
Well, I mean, I guess Bloomberg's been experimenting that with relatively recently. I'm not sure we have enough data right now to really be able to go and answer the impact of that one way or the other. I'll say New York has been one example where police generally have had a huge impact on crime. Giuliani, when he became mayor, he increased the police force about 50%, and he also changed the hiring rules for police officers fairly dramatically. He reimposed physical strength requirements that had pretty much been dropped and other types of testing to make sure you got higher quality people. So Giuliani made it so that you had a large increase in the number of police and also a big increase in the quality of the people that were police officers at that time. But you know, the particular policy that you're talking about where they're stopping people, you know, it'll be interesting to see. I can't, you know, I try to limit myself to things that we've studied well, and I don't think we've studied that enough to tell you what impact it's going to have on crime rates.
Yes, sir.
We've heard a lot of statistics around during the last hour. Is there some place we can go and find these in case we can't remember them all off the top of our head?
Well, it's one reason why I wrote the book. So, they got it for sale there. I mean, a lot of this stuff about a lot of the current debate is in At the Brink, and some of the other graphs that I have are also in my book, More Guns, Less Crime. But a lot of the current debate is in my recent book, At the Brink.
And we're going over here.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments on specifically the Defense Distributed Wiki Weapon Project, 3D printing a gun, but sort of in a larger context, disruptive or emerging technologies and how they might influence or reframe the gun control debate.
Well, I think practically it's not going to have a big impact in the sense that it's already been very difficult to stop criminals from going and getting guns. What I will say is these, you know, mechanical printing of guns, I think you still got a ways to go to actually have a gun that you can actually print. Now, if you're talking about things like magazines, you know, that's trivial. But magazines are already probably the easiest part of the gun to go and make in any case. But the problem that you have with printing weapons is the barrel has to withstand explosive forces there, and really only metal can do that. And so, you know, they can have kind of metal laced in there, but it really has to be kind of a continuous thing. I know that they may show that you can fire 1 or 2 bullets or something, but what I would say is if you do that, you're taking your safety in your own hands by firing the gun there, because the risk that you face is that this kind of plastic or plastic metal composite, you just risk it exploding in your face and the shrapnel going all over the place. So he's talking about these machines where they can essentially just literally print out parts, or in this case, an entire gun that's there. So I don't know, maybe 10 years from now or 5 years from now, they'll be able to get the rest of the gun. But I don't think, I mean, you know, as opposed, you know, things like magazines, we already tried magazine limits. We did that for 10 years with the original assault weapons ban. Now, it's true, grandfathered in, but magazines deteriorate over time, particularly springs and things like that. And you would have imagined you would have gotten a bigger impact towards the end of the 10-year period than you did earlier. And there are lots of studies, even studies that Bill Clinton's administration funded, that didn't find any benefits. I don't know of any studies by academic, you know, in peer-reviewed publications by criminologists or economists that found a benefit from those laws.
Right here.
You know, I think one reaction that we find, and obviously Newtown is one of the most recent, if not the most recent in this country, and let's just assume, you know, that I'm the mayor of Newtown, and I, you know, want to do something to try to have a beneficial, well, preventive to anything. I mean, and I don't want to do anything that's not beneficial. I don't want to do anything that's counterproductive. And I come to you and I say, okay, you know, I'm hurting. You know, my community's hurting. I want to do something.
Right.
What can I do that might have had some kind of beneficial effect to prevent what took place in Newtown? I mean, the statistics are a lot of what we live by and certainly learn by. But what, you know, you obviously have a natural need to react to something like that. So if I was the mayor of Newtown and was asking you, what can I do? Is there anything I can do for my city or my community that might have had some beneficial effect on preventing that from happening?
Right. Well, I guess the one thing I would ask people to think about are these gun-free zones that are set up. You know, it's interesting, Connecticut, prior to the 1995 Gun-Free School Zone Act, would have allowed people with concealed carry permits to carry guns there. In fact, the states that allowed concealed carry at that time allowed people to carry guns in places like schools. You know, kind of these modern attacks, you know, starting in '97 with the Pearl, Mississippi High School, basically are occurring after we've created these gun-free zones that are there. Look, I could just give you one, I mean, I could go on for a long time. I mentioned how one common feature is that they keep on attacking where guns are banned. You know, Columbine. What a lot of people don't know is, but it was actually reported in the New York Times, is that the two kids, particularly Dylan Klebold, was very strongly against the concealed handgun law that was being debated in the Colorado state legislature at the time. And he was actually wrote his state legislators opposing it, particularly the part about the fact that that law would have allowed people to carry concealed handguns on school property. And one thing most people don't realize is the very day of the Columbine attack was the very day that the state legislature was scheduled for final passage of the concealed handgun law that was there. You know, at some point, there are two issues here. I just think it's hard to ignore the fact that worldwide, these killers keep on picking out the one places where victims aren't able to go and defend themselves. You know, at some point, it just can't be random there. And I don't take this lightly. I've been an academic most of my adult life. I don't take it lightly allowing people to carry concealed handguns. I have 5 kids. A couple of them are still in college. I have one daughter that's still at home, that still goes to the local schools that are there. You know, here's a way to think about this. Let's say, God forbid, a criminal was stalking you or your family, was really seriously threatening you. Would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said, this home is a gun-free zone? My guess is you wouldn't do a sign like that. I've debated lots of gun control proponents. I've never had one that's agreed that they would put up a sign like that in front of their home. And it's pretty obvious why nobody would put up a sign like that, because rather than repelling the criminal, it actually serves as a magnet for him to go there, right? Because he knows that if he attacks you there, he has less to worry about in terms of you being able to go and defend yourself. The question is, if no one would put up a sign like that in front of their own home, why do we put those signs up in front of other places? Why do we put a sign like that in front of the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado? Why do we put these signs up in other places like that? And so I don't know if this answers your question well enough, but you know, I'm not saying, you know, to me, all this would have been unintuitive at one point in my life. I didn't, you know, if anybody reads my stuff, I never make Second Amendment arguments on these things. What motivated me looking at this stuff was just the safety issue here to begin with. And it just seems, and you know, I actually wrote some things prior to my, you know, empirical research where I would have questioned these things. But you know, it's kind of hard to look at these stuff and just see how can you deal with all these things. Just with just two exceptions, all these multiple victim public shootings keep on taking place where guns are banned. You know, I have 7 malls in Omaha, Nebraska. Only one had posted signs banning permanently concealed handguns. Where do you think the mall attack occurred there? It occurred in the only one that was there, that they banned it. Salt Lake City, a few years ago, had a shooting in a mall. Had 8 enclosed malls there. 2 of them had signs banning permanently concealed handguns. The guy went into one of those. You look at all the attacks we could talk about from last year, they keep on trying to find places, apparently, because there are other options. The guy could have gone in Aurora, he could have gone to other movie theaters, others that were even closer to his home. Why did he pick this one? And we found out later, you know, who knows, maybe somebody will ask him. He's still alive, he's one of the rare ones that are still alive. But, you know, it's just, at some point, I think we need to address this type of thing.
Right there.
Thank you, sir. My question is in relationship to what you talked about for us. Chicago is a perfect example. The guns that are being used for the murders in the schools are not the assault weapons, and most of those guns are bought through the black market. And the importation of drugs as well as the importation of guns in Chicago is the real issue. So now how is it that law enforcement or the community should approach those kinds of institutional gun sales within the city? For example, the city of Little Rock, there's no gun ban. But all of the murders of African Americans in our community comes as a result of guns which are locally procured. And most of those guns, if traced, go traced back to a person who has bought them legitimately. The question for me is, how do you justify just saying, just everybody providing a gun and knowing that the majority of the guns that are procured are usually guns that are legitimate? And the other question is...
Well, can I answer the first one
yes,
first, and then you can ask a second one if you want to? Because I think it's a very important question that you're bringing up here. Look, let's say something that may or may not be popular, I don't know, but if you really want to reduce gun violence in urban areas, one thing to do is thinking about legalizing drugs. I'll just mention to you, does anybody know, and I'll give Bill Clinton credit for something in a minute, but because, does anybody know what year had the highest murder rate in U.S. history? It's 1932. Within 2 years after 1932, the murder rate had fallen by 60%. Does anybody know what 1932 was? It was the last year of Prohibition. When Prohibition ended on January 1st, 1933, you started seeing this huge drop. You had valuable property. Who controlled the distribution of alcohol in different areas? And the mob back then would go and fight against each other to be the ones that would go and control that area. As soon as that profit was eliminated because they allowed, you know, they didn't have it illegal anymore, you had it so there was no reason to go and fight against each other. Now, with regard to Bill Clinton, what I'll mention is you know, one of the things that Clinton did when he became president was he essentially eliminated the military's role in drug interdiction. George Bush Sr. had cut it back some in 1992, but Clinton really cut it back dramatically, essentially ended it after that. And the thing is, you may remember the 1996 campaign, maybe not, but there was like a week where Bob Dole went after Bill Clinton for the fact that drug use had increased. Does anybody remember that? There's like a big morals issue that he had. Anyway, I'm an economist. Here's the deal. To me, it was pretty simple, because what happened was when Clinton cut back the drug interdiction efforts, you had more drugs coming into the country, but they were from more different sources. Before, it was only like the large cartels that could go and bring in the illegal drugs. And when you had more sources, not only did the price go down, but the profits, because you had so many more sources, were also reduced. And so the incentives for the gangs to go and fight against each other in order to try to control drug turf had gone down. And so when Bob Dole was attacking Clinton for the increase, you know, it was like the 50% increase in cocaine use and stuff. Let me just make something clear. Nothing's nirvana here. You go and you liberalize drug laws, more people are going to use drugs. There are real problems with people using drugs. I'm not going to minimize that in any way. I'm not even going to say that's necessarily what you want to do. But if you want to end gang violence in urban areas, you take away their profits from going and doing that. And so you have a trade-off in life. You're going to have more drug use, but fewer deaths from people fighting in these gangs against each other. And, you know, I think that's the main reason why, you know, starting at the end of the Bush administration, because actually the murder rate started falling in November '91, you started seeing this drop, and it continued and accelerated under the Clinton administration. And I think this is one policy that he had that gets almost no attention, but it had a non-trivial impact in terms of lowering permanently, and it's something, you know, you should be proud of doing, whether, you know, it was politically difficult or not for him to do at the time. I don't know. So,
Dr. Lott, thank you so much for coming. I know there's lots of more questions out there. He will be in the back. If you want to continue this conversation, and I appreciate you all coming out, and we'll see you at the next one.